Hi, Otto here for Bavarian Autosport. In today's how-to video, we're going to be showing you how to replace clutch and flywheel on a typical BMW model. Today's car is going to be a 2003 530i, but the procedures shown will apply to most BMW models. For details on your specific BMW model, the Bentley Repair Manual will give you all the extra information that you need. Now we have a couple of different ways we can replace the clutch and flywheel on a BMW. Now this late model car we're using has what's known as a self-adjusting clutch. It's a unique assembly and has some unique assembly procedures. We also have the option of replacing the self-adjusting clutch with a non-self-adjusting clutch. We have conversion kits for this. Why would we want to do that? Further on in the video we'll tell you why. We also have a non-dual mass flywheel conversion to replace the dual mass flywheel on most late model BMWs. Again, later in the video we'll tell you why you might want to do this. Now in this particular installation, we're going to be installing the UUC lightweight flywheel and performance clutch option. That'll be our final installation, although we'll show you how to do these others in at the same time. Now when you buy a clutch kit, you also get all of these extra parts that you want to replace while you're doing the job, such as flywheel bolts, pilot bearing, shifter shaft bearing for the shifter shaft seal for the transmission, exhaust gaskets, pressure plate bolts, exhaust nuts or other hardware is required, alignment tool, input seal for the transmission, output seal for the transmission, rear main seal for the engine, our throw-up bearing that we always want to replace, and then other things we'll look at are flex discs, since we'll have it apart, a pilot bearing removal tool, some Allen head tools for removing the lock plate on the self-adjusting clutch, our Liqui-Moly anti-seize compound, and a torque wrench. Now other than this, we need to get the car in the air. We can do this with a jack and jack stands, ramps, or a lift. Of course we'll be using a lift today. And we need all of our regular metric hand tools, sockets, ratchets, screwdrivers, pliers, and wrenches. With that, let's go ahead and get moving on the job. We've got a lot to do. Here we are under the vehicle. Our first task is to remove the exhaust system. In order to prep for that, we've already sprayed our fasteners with the deoxit mechanic all penetrant so that they'll come off nice and easy. Now we'll use our 14mm socket and remove the forward exhaust flange nuts. We'll remove the center hanger. You'll see that we're using air tools for most of this job. This just simply makes the job faster. You'll probably be using hand tools. Now we'll remove the rest of the hangers and cross members in order to finish removing the exhaust. Now we'll lower the exhaust, disconnect the oxygen sensors if they're in this section of the exhaust, and remove it from under the car. Now we'll remove any undercar heat shields to expose the drive shaft. And next we have another cross member on this vehicle to remove. Our next task will be to disconnect the drive shaft coupling flex disc or gleebo. We'll use a socket and a extension with a wrench on the forward side to hold the nuts. With all of the bolts removed, we'll now remove the center bearing mounting nuts or bolts. Pull the drive shaft down in the center and pull it away from the transmission output shaft. Inspect your flex disc to look for any cracks in the rubber. If there are any cracks, replace the flex disc. We'll now disconnect and remove the various shifter parts. Watch our video on installing a short shift kit for details in this area. Here we're disconnecting the shifter support arm from the back of the transmission. Alright, now we're ready to disconnect the transmission itself and the cross member. We have bolts on the bell housing, a bracket in the way here. our reverse light switch, and the slave cylinder. First, we'll loosen the bolts on the transmission bell housing. This will be a combination of tools from sockets to extensions to wobble pieces and universal joints, anywhere from a few inches long to a couple of feet long to get to all of the bolts. Here we're removing an upper one with a universal joint. These lower ones are fairly easy to get to. Now for the upper bolts, we'll use a long extension, a universal joint, and our socket. As you can see, we're using various combinations of tools to get to the different bolts. Here we're removing the slave cylinder. There are two nuts securing it. And you would use this same procedure to remove the slave cylinder if that's all you're replacing on the vehicle outside of a clutch job. Pull the slave cylinder off the side of the transmission, leave the hydraulics connected, and simply set it aside. Here's your unlock valve. Okay, now we have our transmission jack affixed to the transmission, and we're going to remove the cross member so that we can lower the transmission a bit. The two upper bolts on the transmission bell housing are difficult to get to, and lowering the transmission just a little bit will allow us to get the tool up over the top of the transmission. And here we're removing those two upper bolts. Once these bolts are removed, the transmission will be free except for one small bolt on the front with the flex shield. Here we're removing that bolt to remove the flex shield. Transmission is now free. We'll gently pry to move it back from the engine. We're going to move it back and lower it. Watch for the input shaft clearing the clutch. Make sure you have the transmission moved far enough rearward. Here we have our input shaft and inserts into the clutch right here. Okay, now we're ready to remove the clutch assembly. Note that we have the ring gear here and we have the main clutch. Check out the play in the dual mass flywheel. Note that the ring gear isn't moving, but the center part of the flywheel and the clutch is. This dual mass flywheel is worn out. We also have lateral play. This will cause odd clutch wear. Okay, now we're going to use our socket and ratchet to remove the pressure plate bolts so we can remove the clutch assembly. Now with the clutch assembly down, note the wear on the outside edges of the clutch disc. This is due to the lateral play in the dual mass flywheel. A new clutch on this flywheel will simply wear the same way. Note the wear marks on the flywheel itself. And again, here's the play on the dual mass flywheel. Note the driven section is moving more than the drive section. We'll now remove the flywheel bolts in a crisscross pattern. In removing the flywheel itself, gently pry in a couple of positions. Be careful, the flywheel is quite heavy. It can be up to 30 pounds. Once we have the flywheel moving on the crankshaft output, we'll put the pry bar down and we'll just wobble it back and forth by hand to make sure we have a good grasp on it. And there we go. We're now ready to remove the rear main seal carrier. The seal is mounted in this carrier with the bolts around. Note the ones that go through the oil pan. Remove all the bolts and gently pry on the carrier to release it and pull it off the end of the crankshaft. Here's your seal within the carrier. Note that the oil pan gasket does stick out past the rear of the block. In other words, the seal carrier seals to the gasket via the oil pan. We'll have to reuse this section of the oil pan gasket. We'll prep it by prying it gently away from the oil pan and cleaning it well with brake parts cleaner. Spray the brake parts cleaner into the gap between the gasket and the oil pan. We'll use a pig mat, absorbent mat, to catch the dripping brake cleaner. After cleaning the oil pan gasket, we'll now remove the seal retainer gasket from the back of the block. Gently pry it away from the engine block. Now we'll use a gasket sealer between the oil pan gasket and the oil pan. We'll squirt the sealer in the gap between the pried up gasket and the oil pan itself. And we'll also put some sealer in the corners where the seal retainer housing gasket comes up against the engine block. Now we'll install the seal retainer with the new seal installed. Carefully push the lip of the seal around the edge of the crankshaft. With everything in place, we'll torque all of the bolts down to specification. Now we'll remove the pilot bearing from the end of the crankshaft using the pilot bearing removal tool. Insert the base of the tool into the pilot bearing. Note how the collar ring locks the jaws of the tool. Insert the tool, run the collar ring down to expand the jaws, and lock the tool within the pilot bearing. Use some channel lock pliers to tighten the lock ring on the tool. Next, we'll insert the center press rod into the pilot bearing tool, and we will hold the base of the tool and turn the press rod in order to pull the bearing out. Turn the press rod clockwise until the bearing pulls out. Once we have the pilot bearing removed, the new bearing can be installed. Install and press the new bearing into place using an arbor tool or a socket that is close to the outside diameter of the bearing. Tap the bearing into place until seated. Note that earlier models may have a separate pilot bearing seal assembly in addition to the pilot bearing itself. Note that this vehicle had a worn-out dual-mass flywheel. Why would we want to put a new clutch on that worn-out flywheel? That will cause jerky acceleration as well as premature wear on the clutch. What we would actually do is install a replacement dual-mass flywheel and self-adjusting clutch conversion. This flywheel is the same size and same mass and same fitment as the dual-mass flywheel, but it's a one-piece solid flywheel, so we get rid of the spring in the flywheel that wears out for a much smoother drivetrain operation. Additionally, the clutch is a non-self-adjusting design, so we get rid of all of the problems of clutch feel and premature wear that come along with the self-adjusting clutch design. This will improve our drivability and the longevity of the clutch assembly by far. Now we're ready to install the new clutch disc and pressure plate. Note that the clutch disc does have a specific forward and rearward facing orientation. The disc will be marked which side goes toward the engine and which side goes toward the transmission. We'll use our pilot bearing tool to install the clutch disc. This particular application is what's known as a self-adjusting clutch. So the pilot tool looks a little bit different than a typical one-piece tool. Install the tool and the disc. Remove the bolt. We'll get our pressure plate up into place. Note the locking plate on this self-adjusting clutch pressure plate. Do not remove the locking plate yet. Note our alignment dowel pins that match up with the pressure plate. Get the pressure plate into place on the dowel pins. Use new bolts for the pressure plate due to the anti-lock compound on the bolts. In a crisscross pattern, tighten the pressure plate down until the bolts are fully down. Torque to specification. Once the pressure plate has been fully torqued to specification, we can remove the center locking plate on the self-adjusting pressure plate. We'll use a hex head tool, this one is 14 millimeters, to remove the lock plate. After the locking ring is removed, we'll install the bolt into the end of the alignment tool so we can pull the alignment tool out of the clutch disc. At that point, we're ready for the rest of the assembly with the transmission.